On a scorching afternoon in the barren trails of Red Mesa Territory, a widowed father with nothing but a broken wagon and a hungry daughter stops to help a stranded woman fix her wagon wheel. He doesn't ask for payment. He doesn't expect anything in return. But what he doesn't know is that the woman he just helped owns half the territory, and the kindness he just showed is about to change his life forever. Though not everyone at her ranch is ready to accept a drifter like him. Some will do everything in their power to make sure he fails. This is the story of how one act of decency became a fight for survival, respect, and a future worth living. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty trail leading out of Dust Creek, turning the air into a shimmering haze that made the horizon dance like a mirage. Caleb Morgan trudged alongside his rickety wagon, his worn boots kicking up small clouds of dirt with each step. His shirt, once white, was now stained with sweat and dust, clinging to his back as he pulled the wagon forward. Beside him, little Lily walked with her head down, her small hand gripping the side of the wagon for support. The wagon itself was a sorry sight, patched together with whatever scraps Caleb could find, its wooden wheels creaking with every rotation, threatening to give out at any moment. Inside lay everything they owned: a few threadbare blankets, a dented pot, some tools, and the last of their dried meat wrapped in cloth. It wasn't much. It was barely anything. Caleb's jaw tightened as he glanced down at Lily. Her face was flushed from the heat, her lips cracked and dry. She hadn't complained once, not about the heat, not about the hunger, not about the fact that they'd been walking for 3 days straight with nowhere to go. That silent resilience broke his heart more than any tears ever could. They'd been evicted from the boarding house in Dust Creek 2 weeks ago. The landlord had been patient. Caleb would give him that. But patience only stretched so far when rent went unpaid for 3 months. After his wife Sarah died from fever last winter, everything had fallen apart. The ranch where he'd worked for 5 years had shut down when the owner sold the land to a railroad company. Jobs were scarce, and the few he could find, hauling freight, mending fences, shoeing horses, barely kept them fed, let alone housed. Now they were heading toward Carson Flats, a town nearly 40 miles west, where Caleb had heard rumors of work at a new cattle outfit. Rumors. That's all he had left to go on. Rumors and hope, and both were wearing thin. "Daddy," Lily's small voice broke through his thoughts. "Can we rest soon?" Caleb stopped, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked down at her, at those big brown eyes that still held trust despite everything, and forced a smile he didn't feel. "Just a little further, darlin'. There's some shade up ahead by those rocks. We'll rest there, I promise." Lily nodded, her little legs pushing forward without complaint. Caleb's chest tightened. She deserved better than this. Better than a father who couldn't keep a roof over her head. Better than walking through the desert with nothing but empty promises. He thought about Sarah constantly. What would she say if she could see them now? Would she blame him? Would she be disappointed that he couldn't hold things together after she was gone? The guilt gnawed at him like a hungry animal, relentless and sharp. They reached the shade of the rocky outcrop, and Caleb helped Lily sit down. Handing her their canteen, she took small sips, rationing the water without being told. 7 years old, and already she understood scarcity better than most adults. Caleb sat beside her, staring out at the endless expanse of red dirt and sagebrush. The West was supposed to be a land of opportunity, a place where a man could build something if he worked hard enough. But all Caleb had built was a pile of failures. Still, he couldn't give up, not while Lily needed him. "You know what, Lily?" he said softly, putting his arm around her thin shoulders. "When we get to Carson Flats, things are going to be different. I'm going to find work, and we're going to get a real place to stay. Maybe even a little house with a garden, just like Mama wanted." Lily leaned into him, her voice barely a whisper. "I believe you, Daddy." Those words should have filled him with determination. Instead, they filled him with dread, because he wasn't sure he believed himself anymore. But he had to try. For her, he had to keep trying. They'd been back on the trail for less than an hour when Caleb spotted the wagon up ahead. At first, he thought it was abandoned, just another relic left to rot under the merciless sun, like so many others he'd seen dotting the western landscape. But as they drew closer, he noticed movement. A figure in a deep green riding dress stood beside the wagon, struggling with something near the rear wheel. Caleb slowed his pace, instinct telling him to assess the situation before getting involved. Out here, you never knew what trouble looked like until you were already neck-deep in it. But then Lily tugged on his sleeve. "Papa, look. That lady needs help." He followed her gaze. The woman was alone, that much was clear. No horse in sight, no companions, just her, and a disabled wagon in the middle of nowhere. The wheel had come loose, tilted at an awkward angle that would make travel impossible. Caleb hesitated. They were already behind schedule, and every minute spent not moving toward Carson Flats was a minute closer to running out of water and food. But leaving someone stranded out here, especially a woman alone, that wasn't something he could do. Sarah wouldn't have stood for it, and he'd be damned if he'd let desperation turn him into the kind of man who walked past someone in need. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to Lily. "Let's see if we can help." As they approached, the woman turned to face them. She was older than he'd first thought, perhaps in her mid-40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed him immediately. Her dress, though dusty from travel, was finely made, the kind of clothing that spoke of money. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and despite the heat, she maintained a composed, almost regal bearing. Those sharp eyes swept over Caleb, taking in his ragged clothes, his sun-darkened skin, his weathered face, and the small girl clinging to his side. He saw the calculation happen in real time, the slight stiffening of her posture, the way her hand moved almost imperceptibly toward the small Derringer pistol holstered at her waist. He'd seen that look before, knew exactly what it meant. "Ma'am," Caleb said evenly, stopping a respectful distance away and raising his hand slightly to show he meant no harm. "Looks like you got some trouble with that wheel." The woman's expression remained guarded. "I do. I've sent my driver into Red Mesa for help, but that was over an hour ago." "Red Mesa's a good 6 miles back," Caleb said, glancing at the broken wheel. "Your man won't be back for a while yet, especially if he's on foot." "He took my horse," she replied curtly, her tone making it clear she wasn't interested in small talk. Caleb nodded, understanding the unspoken message. She didn't trust him. Couldn't blame her for that. A lone woman, a strange man, appearing out of nowhere. But he could also see the worry in her eyes, the way she kept glancing at the sun sinking lower in the sky. "I can fix it," he offered. "Won't take but 20 minutes if you've got a spare pin and some grease." Victoria Brennan, though he didn't know her name yet, studied him for a long moment. Her gaze shifted to Lily, who stood quietly beside him, then back to Caleb. Finally, she gave a small, reluctant nod. "I have tools in the back, but I'll be watching. Wouldn't expect anything less, ma'am." Caleb moved to the wagon, kneeling beside the damaged wheel. Lily, ever curious, came to stand beside him, holding out her small hands as if ready to help. The woman watched them both, her hand never straying far from that Derringer. "My papa's really good at fixing things," Lily announced cheerfully, directing her comment at the woman. "He says when something's broken, you don't throw it away, you figure out how to make it work again." Despite herself, Victoria's expression softened just slightly. "Is that so?" "Yes, ma'am," Lily continued, undeterred by the woman's cool demeanor. "He fixed our wagon 3 times already, and he can shoe horses and mend saddles and—" "Lily," Caleb interrupted gently, though a small smile tugged at his lips. "Let me work, darlin'." He examined the wheel assembly, quickly identifying the problem. The linchpin had sheared clean through, likely from hitting a rock or rut too hard. The wheel hub was intact, though, which meant it was fixable. "You got a spare pin?" he asked. Victoria retrieved a small wooden box from inside the wagon, handing it to him with obvious reluctance. Inside were various tools and replacement parts, more than most travelers would carry. This woman was prepared, which told him she'd done plenty of traveling in rough country. Caleb got to work, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. He could feel Victoria's eyes on him the entire time, watching every movement as if expecting him to suddenly pocket something or make a wrong move. The distrust stung, but he understood it. Out here, trust was a luxury most people couldn't afford. Lily sat in the shade of the wagon, humming softly to herself. The sound was a small comfort, a reminder of innocence in a world that seemed determined to grind it away. True to his word, Caleb had the wheel secured in just under 20 minutes. He stood wiping his hands on his already dirty pants and gave the wheel a firm shake to test it. "Should hold you all the way to wherever you're headed," he said, "though you'll want to replace that pin with something sturdier when you get the chance." Victoria stepped forward, examining his work with a critical eye. After a moment, she reached into a small purse attached to her belt and pulled out several silver dollars. "For your trouble," she said, extending the coins toward him. Caleb looked at the money, more than he'd seen in weeks, and felt the weight of temptation. That silver could buy food, supplies, maybe even secure them a place to stay for a few nights. But he thought of Sarah, of the values she'd taught him, of the man he wanted Lily to see when she looked at him. He shook his head. "No need, ma'am. Just glad we could help." Victoria's eyes widened slightly, genuine surprise breaking through her carefully maintained composure. "You're refusing payment? Helping someone ain't something that needs paying for," Caleb said simply. "You have a safe journey, ma'am." He turned to gather Lily, ready to continue their own journey, when Victoria's voice stopped him. "Wait." Caleb turned back, surprised by the urgency in the woman's voice. She stood there, studying him, with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle she hadn't expected to encounter. "You're headed west," she observed, not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Carson Flats. Heard there might be work there." "Might be," she repeated, a slight edge to her voice. "That's a long walk on maybes, especially with a child." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He didn't need a lecture from a stranger, no matter how well-intentioned. "We'll manage." "I'm sure you will," Victoria said, her tone softening slightly. She paused, seeming to wrestle with something internally. Finally, she extended her hand. "Victoria Brennan." Caleb hesitated, then shook her hand. Her grip was firm, businesslike. "Caleb Morgan." "This is my daughter, Lily." "Pleased to meet you, ma'am," Lily said politely, just as Sarah had taught her. Victoria's expression shifted, something almost melancholic crossing her features as she looked at the little girl. Then she turned her attention back to Caleb. "Brennan," she repeated, watching his face carefully. "As in Brennan Ranch, Brennan Cattle Company." The name struck him like a physical blow. Everyone within 200 miles knew that name. Victoria Brennan wasn't just wealthy. She was one of the most powerful landowners in the territory, controlling thousands of acres of prime grazing land, water rights, and cattle. Some said she owned half of Red Mesa territory, and the other half was too scared to argue about it, and he'd just turned down her money. "I see you've heard of me," Victoria said, a hint of amusement in her voice at his stunned expression. "Ma'am, I didn't realize," she waved off his stammering. "No reason you should have. I don't exactly advertise when I'm traveling." She paused, then asked, "What kind of work are you looking for in Carson Flats?" Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "Anything honest. I'm good with my hands, worked ranches most of my life. Can handle horses, mend equipment, build fences, whatever needs doing. And you're walking 40 miles on the hope that someone might hire you when you get there." It wasn't a question, but Caleb answered anyway. "Yes, ma'am." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from him to the wagon wheel he just repaired, then to Lily, and finally back to him. He could practically see her mind working, calculating, weighing options. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Morgan," she said finally. "My ranch is 10 miles south of here. I'm in need of someone to oversee equipment maintenance and repairs, wagons, tools, the mechanical operations we use. Someone who knows what they're doing and doesn't need constant supervision." Caleb's heart began to pound. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to men like him. "Ma'am, I appreciate the thought, but I'm not offering out of charity," Victoria cut in sharply, as if reading his thoughts. "I watched you work. You're efficient, knowledgeable, and you didn't try to impress me with unnecessary talk. That tells me you actually know your trade. Those are qualities I value." "I've never run operations for an outfit that size," Caleb admitted, honesty compelling him to voice his doubts. "No, but you've worked ranches. You understand the work. The rest you can learn." She paused, her expression hardening slightly. "However, I don't hire anyone permanently without a trial period. 30 days. You prove yourself. The position is yours with full wages and housing. You don't. You leave with a month's pay and no hard feelings." Caleb's mind raced. A real job, steady pay, housing, which meant a roof over Lily's head, meals, stability, everything he'd been desperately searching for, offered to him on a dusty trail by a woman he'd helped without expecting anything in return. But years of disappointment had taught him to be wary of things that seemed too good to be true. "Why me?" he asked, his voice cautious. "You could hire anyone. Someone with references, experience with large operations. Why offer this to a drifter you just met?" Victoria's expression shifted, something unreadable passing across her features. "You want the truth, Mr. Morgan?" "Always. Because you refused my money," she said simply. "In my experience, men who refuse payment for honest work when they clearly need it are either fools or men of principle. You don't strike me as a fool." She paused. "And because I've learned that character matters more than credentials. Skills can be taught. Integrity cannot." Caleb felt the weight of her words, but doubt still gnawed at him. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but people like you don't usually take chances on people like me." A ghost of a smile touched Victoria's lips. "People like me? People with power, with money, with something to lose." He met her gaze steadily. "In my experience, when folks like that notice folks like me, it's usually because they want something specific, something that benefits them more than it benefits us." Instead of taking offense, Victoria nodded slowly. "You're right to be skeptical. Most people in my position would use you up and throw you away the moment you stopped being useful." Her voice took on a harder edge. "But I'm not most people, Mr. Morgan. I built everything I have from nothing, and I remember what it's like to be desperate, to be overlooked, to have doors slammed in my face because of who I was or where I came from." She stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "I'm offering you this opportunity because I believe you can do the work. But make no mistake, this isn't a gift. You'll earn every penny, and if you can't handle it, I won't keep you on out of sentiment. I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you." Caleb looked down at Lily, who gazed up at him with those trusting eyes. He thought of the long walk still ahead to Carson Flats, of the dwindling supplies, of the uncertainty waiting at the end of that journey. Then he thought of Sarah, of the life she'd wanted for their daughter, of the promise he'd made to keep Lily safe, to give her a future. He took a deep breath and met Victoria's eyes. "When do I start?" Tightened. He'd worked ranches before, but nothing remotely close to this scale. "Impressive, isn't it?" Victoria said, noticing his expression. "Yes, ma'am," Caleb replied quietly. "It surely is." The wagon rolled to a stop in front of a long, low building near the equipment sheds. Victoria climbed down, gesturing for Caleb and Lily to follow. Several ranch hands had stopped their work to watch, their curious gazes following the newcomers. "This is the foreman's office," Victoria explained, leading them inside. The interior was sparse but functional, a desk covered with papers, maps on the walls, tools hanging from hooks. A man sat at the desk, a thick-shouldered figure with a weathered face and hard eyes. He looked up as they entered, his gaze immediately locking onto Caleb with undisguised suspicion. "Garrett," Victoria said briskly, "this is Caleb Morgan. He'll be taking over maintenance operations. Morgan, this is Garrett Wade, my foreman." Garrett rose slowly, his considerable height meant to intimidate. He didn't offer his hand. "Maintenance operations?" His voice carried a distinct edge. "Thought we already had that covered." "We do," Victoria replied coolly. "Now we'll have it covered better. Morgan will oversee all equipment repairs, wagon maintenance, and mechanical operations. You'll coordinate with him on scheduling and priorities." Garrett's jaw worked, as if chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. His eyes swept over Caleb again, lingering on his worn clothes and dusty appearance. "Where'd you find this one?" "That's not your concern," Victoria said, her tone brooking no argument. "What is your concern is making sure he has access to the workshops, tools, and whatever else he needs to do his job. Understood?" "Understood," Garrett said flatly, though his expression suggested otherwise. Victoria turned to Caleb. "There's a small cabin behind the third bunkhouse. It's yours for the duration of your employment. Not fancy, but it's private, has a stove, and it's weatherproof. Better than most." "Thank you, ma'am," Caleb said, genuinely grateful. Private housing meant Lily would have stability, safety. "You'll start tomorrow at dawn," Victoria continued. "Garrett will show you the equipment sheds and introduce you to the crew. Any questions?" Caleb had 100 questions, but he could feel Garrett's hostile gaze boring into him, and decided now wasn't the time. "No, ma'am, I'll be ready." Victoria nodded and swept out, leaving Caleb alone with Garrett. The silence that followed was thick with tension. "Let me make something clear," Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous. "I don't know what you did to charm Mrs. Brennan, but out here, you're just another hired hand. You don't get special treatment, and you sure as hell don't get to waltz in here and start giving orders to men who've been working this ranch for years." Caleb kept his expression neutral, not looking to give orders. "Just looking to do my job." "Your job," Garrett repeated with a sneer. "You even know the first thing about running operations this size? Or did you just smile pretty and hope for the best?" "I know my way around equipment," Caleb said evenly. "That's all I need to know." Garrett stepped closer, using his height to loom over Caleb. "There's men here who've earned their place. Men who've bled for this ranch. You think they're going to take orders from some drifter who showed up out of nowhere?" "Like I said," Caleb replied, refusing to be intimidated. "Not here to give orders, just here to work." For a moment it seemed like Garrett might push further, but then he stepped back with a cold smile. "We'll see how long you last. Most outsiders don't make it through the first week." He brushed past Caleb and out the door, leaving the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Lily tugged on Caleb's sleeve, her voice small. "Papa, I don't think that man likes us." Caleb knelt down, forcing a reassuring smile as he brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Some folks take time to warm up, darlin'. We just got to show them we belong here." But as he stood and looked out the window at the sprawling ranch, watching the men who'd stopped to stare at him, with varying degrees of suspicion and hostility, he wondered if belonging was even possible. They found the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. It was small, just one room with a pot-bellied stove, a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a single window that looked out toward the mountains. But it was clean, solid, and most importantly, it was theirs. Lily explored every corner with excitement, declaring it a castle compared to the wagon they'd been living out of. Caleb set their meager belongings down and lit the stove, grateful for the warmth as the desert evening began to cool. As Lily chattered about their new home, Caleb stood at the window, watching the ranch settle into evening routines. Men moved between buildings, horses were fed and bedded down, and smoke rose from chimneys across the compound. Somewhere out there, Garrett Wade was likely already spreading word about the stranger Mrs. Brennan had brought in, already turning the other workers against him before he'd even had a chance to prove himself. Caleb had faced prejudice before, had dealt with men who judged him before knowing him. But this felt different. This felt like walking into enemy territory with a target painted on his back. Still, he'd made a promise to Lily, to Sarah's memory. He'd make this work, no matter what it took. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. Dawn came too early, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, as Caleb made his way toward the equipment sheds. He'd left Lily with one of the ranch cook's wives, a kind older woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd offered to watch her during work hours. Lily had been nervous, but she'd put on a brave face, just like she always did. The sheds were massive structures filled with wagons, plows, harnesses, and machinery in various states of repair. The smell of oil, leather, and metal hung thick in the air. A dozen men were already there, gathered in a loose cluster near the main workbenches. They stopped talking the moment Caleb entered. Garrett stood at the center of the group, arms crossed, wearing an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for this moment. "Well, look who decided to show up. Boys, this is Caleb Morgan, Mrs. Brennan's new maintenance overseer." The way he said the title dripped with mockery. A few men chuckled. Others just stared with cold, measuring eyes. "Morgan here is going to tell us how to do our jobs," Garrett continued, even though he just crawled in off the trail yesterday looking like something the buzzards wouldn't eat. More laughter, louder this time. Caleb kept his expression neutral, his voice calm. "Not here to tell anyone how to do anything. Just here to keep the equipment running smooth." "That's so." A younger man stepped forward, lean and wiry with a crooked grin. "'Cause we've been keeping things running just fine without you." "I'm sure you have," Caleb replied evenly. Garrett moved closer, his bulk blocking the morning light streaming through the doorway. "Tell you what, Morgan. Why don't you show us what you got? Prove you're worth the space you're taking up." It was a challenge, plain and simple. Every man in that shed knew it. Caleb could feel the weight of their attention, the collective judgment pressing down on him like a physical force. "What did you have in mind?" Caleb asked. Garrett's smile widened. "We got a freight wagon outside. Axel's been giving us trouble for weeks. Keeps seizing up, makes an awful grinding noise. You figure out what's wrong and fix it by noon, maybe we'll believe you know what you're talking about. And if I can't, then maybe you pack up that little girl of yours and head back to whatever hole you crawled out of." The other men shifted, some looking uncomfortable now, others nodding in agreement. This was more than just a test of skill. It was a test of whether Caleb would stand his ground or fold under pressure. Caleb looked at Garrett for a long moment, reading the hostility, the challenge, the certainty that he would fail. Then he nodded. "Show me the wagon. Won't last a day. Charity case. Mrs. Brennan's gone soft." Caleb blocked them out, focusing on the wagon. He ran his hands along the axle, feeling for heat, for resistance, for anything that would tell him what was wrong. The wheel turned, but there was definite friction, an unevenness in the rotation. He knelt down, peering underneath. The axle housing was caked with old grease and dirt, but through the grime he spotted it. A hairline crack in the bearing sleeve, barely visible but enough to throw off the alignment and cause the grinding. But that wasn't the only problem. As he examined further, he noticed the axle pins were worn down on one side, suggesting uneven weight distribution, and the wheel hub itself showed signs of damage from repeated stress. This wasn't a simple fix. This was a complete rebuild. Caleb stood up, wiping his hands, and walked over to where Garrett stood. "It's not just the bearing. The whole assembly's compromised, needs a full overhaul, new sleeve, new pins, and the hub needs to be reforged or replaced." Garrett's expression didn't change. "So you can't fix it?" "I can fix it," Caleb said firmly, "but not by noon. Job like this, done right, takes at least 8 hours, maybe more. Guess you failed then, Garrett said with satisfaction. I said I'd fix it. Didn't say I'd do a half-assed job just to meet an arbitrary deadline. Caleb met his gaze steadily. You want it done fast, or you want it done right? A murmur rippled through the watching men. Garrett's jaw tightened, clearly not expecting that response. Mrs. Brennan pays for quality work, Caleb continued. Rushing a repair like this means that Wagon breaks down again in a month, maybe on a critical supply run. That cost her more than giving me the time to do it properly. For a moment, Garrett seemed at a loss. Then his expression hardened. Fine. You got till end of day, but you better deliver, Morgan. Caleb nodded and turned back to the wagon. He heard Garrett mutter something to the other men, heard their retreating footsteps, but he didn't look back. He had work to do. The hours blurred together. Caleb worked methodically, disassembling the axle piece by piece, cleaning each component, identifying what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. His hands moved with practiced precision, muscle memory from years of similar work guiding him. Some of the men drifted by throughout the day, watching silently. A few offered grudging nods when they saw the extent of the damage he'd uncovered. Others just shook their heads and walked away. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Caleb tightened the final bolt and stepped back. The wagon's axle gleamed with fresh grease, every component properly aligned. The new bearing sleeve fitted perfectly into place. He gave the wheel a spin. It rotated smoothly, silently, no grinding, no resistance. Perfect. Well, I'll be damned. Caleb turned to find an older ranch hand standing behind him, gray-bearded and weathered, watching with something that might have been respect. That's clean work, the man said simply. Real clean. Thank you, Caleb replied. The man spat tobacco juice into the dirt. Name's Rusty, been working these sheds for 15 years. Garrett had 3 different men try to fix that wagon. None of them could figure it out. Caleb nodded, unsure what to say. Rusty looked at him with sharp, measuring eyes. Don't know where you came from, Morgan, or what you did to get here, but you know your trade. That counts for something. He walked away before Caleb could respond, leaving him standing alone in the fading light beside the repaired wagon. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. When Garrett came to inspect the work an hour later, he said nothing. Just circled the wagon, checked the wheel, ran his hand along the axle. His expression remained stony, unreadable. Finally, he looked at Caleb. It'll do. That was all. No acknowledgement of the quality of the work, no admission that Caleb had proven himself. Just 2 words and a dismissive wave before Garrett walked away. But Caleb saw it in the set of his shoulders, in the tightness of his jaw. Garrett had expected him to fail, had wanted him to fail, and that made Caleb's success all the more threatening. The days that followed fell into a grueling rhythm. Caleb worked from dawn until well past dusk, proving himself one repair at a time. Slowly, some of the men began to warm to him. Rusty offered occasional advice. A few younger hands started asking questions about technique, and the hostility in the sheds lessened from open antagonism to wary coexistence. But Garrett's animosity only deepened. It manifested in small ways at first. Tools that went missing from Caleb's workstation, only to turn up hours later in places he'd already searched. Work orders that were never delivered, leaving him scrambling to catch up on repairs he hadn't known were urgent. Supplies that ran out without replacement, forcing him to improvise or halt work entirely. Caleb recognized the pattern. He'd seen it before. The slow, methodical effort to make him look incompetent, to create failures that could be blamed on him. Garrett was too smart to do anything overt, anything that could be traced directly back to him. Instead, he created obstacles and let Caleb stumble over them. The real trouble came in the 3rd week. Caleb had been assigned to inspect and service the ranch's water pump system, a critical piece of machinery that supplied water to the cattle troughs in the southern pastures. It was complex work, requiring careful calibration to maintain proper pressure and flow. He'd spent 2 full days on it, checking every valve, every seal, every connection point. When he finished, he'd tested the system thoroughly. Everything ran perfectly. The next morning, he woke to shouting. He dressed quickly and ran outside to find chaos. Ranch hands were racing toward the southern pastures, and he could see Garrett's distinctive figure on horseback, riding hard. Caleb's stomach dropped. He found Mrs. Chen near the main house. "What happened?" "The water pump," she said, wringing her hands. "It failed overnight. Flooded the equipment shed and left the southern troughs bone dry. Cattle are scattered everywhere looking for water." Caleb's blood ran cold. "That's impossible. I tested that system myself." "Mrs. Brennan's asking for you," Mrs. Chen said quietly. "She's at the pump house now." Caleb ran. By the time he reached the pump house, Victoria was already there, standing in 2 inches of water, her riding skirt soaked to the knees. Garrett stood beside her, arms crossed, wearing an expression of grim satisfaction. "Morgan," Victoria's voice was ice, "explain this." Caleb waded into the flooded shed, immediately going to the pump. Water sprayed from a released pressure valve, and the entire system was shut down. He knelt, examining the valve assembly, and his hands stilled. The valve had been deliberately loosened, not just loose from vibration or pressure. The threads showed fresh scratching, the kind left by a wrench, applied recently and forcefully. This wasn't mechanical failure. This was sabotage. "Well," Garrett's voice cut through the sound of flowing water. "You inspected this system 2 days ago, signed off on it yourself, said it was in perfect working order." "It was," Caleb said, his voice tight. "Clearly not," Garrett shot back. "We've got 300 head of cattle scattered across 5 miles looking for water, an equipment shed that's going to take days to dry out, and damaged supplies, all because you didn't do your job properly." Caleb stood, turning to face Victoria. Water dripped from his clothes, but he kept his voice steady. "Ma'am, this valve was tampered with. I checked every connection myself. This wasn't a failure. Someone did this deliberately." Garrett barked a laugh. Now he's making excuses. "What's next, Morgan? Going to blame ghosts?" "I'm not blaming anyone," Caleb said, though his eyes flicked to Garrett. "I'm stating a fact. That valve was manually loosened after my inspection." Victoria's expression was unreadable. "That's a serious accusation." "It's the truth." "Or," Garrett interjected smoothly, "it's a desperate man trying to cover his mistake. You want Mrs. Brennan to believe that someone, one of the men who've worked here for years, would sabotage our own operation just to make you look bad." Put that way, it sounded absurd. Caleb could see the doubt creeping into Victoria's eyes. Why would anyone risk damaging the ranch, hurting the cattle, just to undermine one man? Unless they wanted him gone badly enough. "Give me 24 hours, Caleb said. "Let me prove what happened." "We don't have 24 hours, Garrett snapped. "We have cattle without water and a mess that needs cleaning up now." Victoria held up a hand, silencing him. She studied Caleb for a long moment, her sharp eyes searching his face. He met her gaze steadily, willing her to see the truth, to trust the same instinct that had made her hire him in the first place. Finally, she spoke. "Fix it, now. We'll discuss what happened afterward." It wasn't the vote of confidence Caleb had hoped for, but it wasn't a dismissal either. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Caleb worked through the afternoon, repairing the valve and getting the pump operational again. By evening, water was flowing to the southern troughs, and the scattered cattle were being rounded up. The immediate crisis was resolved. But the damage to his reputation wasn't. That night, as he sat in the cabin with Lily, he could hear the men talking outside the bunkhouses. Their voices carried on the evening breeze, and though he couldn't make out specific words, the tone was clear. They were talking about him, about the failure, about whether he deserved to be there. Lily climbed into his lap, sensing his distress. "Are we going to have to leave, Papa?" Caleb wrapped his arms around her, resting his chin on top of her head. "No, baby girl, we're not leaving." But as he said the words, he wasn't sure if he was reassuring her or himself. The probation period had less than a week left. One more mistake, or one more incident that looked like a mistake, and Victoria would have every reason to let him go. Garrett had made his move. Now, Caleb had to figure out how to survive the next one, because he had no doubt there would be a next one, and next time, Garrett would make sure it was fatal to his chances. The remaining days of the probation period stretched before Caleb like a tightrope suspended over a canyon. Every action felt scrutinized. Every decision weighed against the possibility of failure. He worked with meticulous care, double-checking everything, documenting his inspections, and when possible, having Rusty or another hand witness his work. Garrett watched him constantly, circling like a vulture waiting for something to die, but Caleb refused to give him the satisfaction. On the 28th day, disaster struck again, but this time it had nothing to do with sabotage. A violent storm rolled across the territory in the dead of night, the kind of tempest that seemed to shake the very earth. Lightning split the sky in jagged white scars, and thunder rattled the windows of every building on the ranch. Caleb barely slept, listening to the fury of wind and rain battering the cabin walls. When dawn finally broke, pale and gray, he emerged to find chaos. The main barn's roof had partially collapsed under the weight of rain and wind. Fence lines were down in multiple pastures, and worst of all, the primary grain mill, a massive piece of equipment essential for processing feed, had been struck by lightning. The entire mechanism was fused and blackened, smoke still rising from the burned-out motor housing. Victoria stood in front of the ruined mill, her face grim as Garrett and several other men surveyed the damage. "It's completely destroyed," Garrett said, shaking his head. "We'll have to send to Santa Fe for parts, maybe even a whole new motor assembly. Could take weeks, maybe a month." "We don't have a month," Victoria replied sharply. "We've got 2,000 head to feed, and winter's coming. Without that mill operational, we can't process enough grain." "Then we'll have to buy processed feed from outside suppliers," Garrett said. "It'll cost a fortune, but there's no other option." Caleb had been standing back, examining the mill from a distance. Now he stepped forward. There might be another way. Every head turned toward him. Garrett's expression immediately hardened. "The motor's gone," Caleb continued, "but the rest of the mechanism is intact. The gears, the grinding plates, the drive shaft, all salvageable. Without a motor, none of that matters," Garrett said dismissively. "No, but we've got 3 old water pumps in the back equipment shed," Caleb replied. "Decommissioned years ago, from what I can tell. One of them has a motor that could be adapted to run the mill. It won't be as powerful as the original, but it'll process enough grain to keep us going until proper replacements arrive." Garrett scoffed. "You're talking about retrofitting a pump motor to run a grain mill? That's insane. The specifications don't match. The power output's all wrong." The power output is 60% of the original," Caleb interrupted calmly, "which means slower processing, but functional. And the mounting brackets can be modified to fit. I'd need help, and I'd need 2 days, but I can make it work." Victoria's eyes locked onto his. "You're certain?" "Yes, ma'am." A long silence stretched across the yard. Caleb could feel Garrett's fury radiating like heat, could see the calculation in Victoria's expression as she weighed the risk of trusting him against the cost of inaction. 2 days, she said finally. "If you can't deliver, we go with Garrett's plan and order from outside suppliers. But if you can make this work—" She paused meaningfully. "Then you'll have proven beyond any doubt that you belong here." Caleb nodded. "I won't let you down." Garrett's jaw clenched so tight, Caleb thought he might hear teeth crack. "This is a mistake, Mrs. Brennan. You're gambling the ranch's feed supply on a drifter's desperation." "I'm gambling on competence," Victoria replied coolly. "Morgan, get started. Garrett, assign him whoever he needs. Caleb worked like a man possessed. He pulled Rusty and two other mechanics to help, and together they dismantled the old pump motor, modified the mounting assembly, and began the painstaking process of integrating it with the mill's drive system. It was brutal work. The parts didn't want to fit. The alignment was off by fractions that might as well have been miles. Every solution created two new problems, and time bled away with merciless speed. Garrett stopped by periodically, always with some comment about wasted effort or inevitable failure. But Caleb ignored him, focusing only on the work, on the promise he'd made to Victoria and to himself. Lily brought him meals that he ate without tasting, and at night, he collapsed into sleep so deep it felt like drowning. On the morning of the second day, as the sun climbed over the eastern mountains, Caleb tightened the final connection and stepped back. The modified motor sat where the old one had been, connected to the mill through a series of adapted belts and pulleys that looked more like a mad inventor's experiment than professional equipment. But it was done. Victoria arrived with Garrett and half the ranch crew as witnesses. The tension was palpable, everyone understanding that this moment would determine Caleb's fate. "Ready?" Victoria asked. Caleb took a deep breath and threw the engagement lever. For one heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the motor coughed to life with a deep, rumbling growl. The drive shaft began to turn, slowly at first, then building momentum. The grinding plates engaged with a satisfying mechanical rhythm, and grain began to flow through the system, processed and ready for feed. It wasn't fast, it wasn't pretty, but it worked. A cheer went up from the assembled workers, spontaneous and genuine. Rusty clapped Caleb on the shoulder so hard he nearly knocked him over, grinning through his gray beard. Even some of the men, who'd been coldest to him, nodded with grudging respect. Victoria stepped forward, her expression unreadable as always, but there was something in her eyes. Approval, satisfaction, maybe even pride. "Well done, Morgan," she said simply. Garrett stood apart from the celebration, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. But he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Caleb had delivered exactly what he promised. That evening, Victoria called him to her office in the main house. The room was lined with ledgers and maps, the headquarters of her empire. She gestured for him to sit. "Your probation period ends tomorrow," she said without preamble. "But I think we both know you've already proven yourself." She slid a document across the desk. "Full-time position, with housing, standard ranch wages, plus a premium for your specialized skills. Contracts for 1 year, renewable based on performance." Caleb stared at the paper, at the numbers that represented security, stability, a future for Lily. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the pen. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "You won't regret this." "I know I won't," Victoria replied. Then more quietly, "You've earned this, Morgan, every bit of it." As Caleb walked back to the cabin that night, contract in hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in over a year. Hope. Real, solid, unshakable hope. He found Lily already asleep, curled up under the blankets. He sat beside her, gently brushing hair from her face, and whispered, "We made it, baby girl. We're going to be okay." For the first time since Sarah died, he actually believed it. 3 weeks passed, and autumn settled over Red Mesa territory like a golden blanket. The ranch continued its rhythms, and Caleb had become a fixture in its daily operations. The modified grain mill ran steadily, and he'd since repaired or improved a dozen other systems across the property. The men no longer watched him with suspicion. Most had accepted him as one of their own. Even Garrett had backed off, though the hostility in his eyes never quite disappeared. He kept his distance, offering only the bare minimum of communication required for coordinating work. Caleb didn't push it. Some wounds didn't heal, they just scarred over. It was a Saturday afternoon when Victoria sent word that she wanted to see him. Caleb found her on the porch of the main house, sitting in a rocking chair with a cup of coffee, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. "Have a seat, Morgan," she said, gesturing to the chair beside her. He sat, uncertain what this was about. Victoria didn't usually call him up for casual conversation. For a long moment she said nothing, just rocked slowly, her gaze distant. Then she spoke, her voice quieter than he'd ever heard it. "I never told you why I really hired you." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "You said it was because I refused your money, because I had integrity." "That was part of it," Victoria acknowledged, "but not all of it." She took a sip of coffee, gathering her thoughts. "I told you once that I grew up poor. That was true. What I didn't tell you was that I grew up in a house very much like that cabin you're living in now." She paused, her expression growing distant with memory. "My father was a ranch hand. Worked himself half to death for men who saw him as expendable. He was talented, could fix anything, build anything, but he never got the chance to show what he could really do. Every time he'd prove himself, they'd find some reason to pass him over for advancement. Wrong background, wrong education, wrong everything." Caleb listened, beginning to understand. "He died when I was 16, Victoria continued, her voice hardening slightly. "Thrown from a horse while working a job that should have gone to someone more experienced, but they gave it to him because he was desperate enough to take it. After he died, my mother and I had nothing. No home, no prospects, no future." She turned to look at Caleb directly now, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "I clawed my way up from that. Married a ranch owner 20 years my senior because it was the only way forward. When he died 5 years later, his family tried to take everything. Said a woman couldn't run a ranch, that I'd only married him for his money. They fought me in court for 2 years. "But you won," Caleb said. "I won," Victoria confirmed. "And I built this empire on the principle that competence matters more than pedigree, that a person's worth isn't determined by where they came from, but by what they can do." She set her coffee cup down on the porch railing. "When I saw you on that trail, helping me without expecting anything in return, working with skill and efficiency despite your circumstances, you reminded me of my father, of the man he could have been if someone had just given him a real chance." Caleb felt his throat tighten. "Ma'am, I didn't hire you out of charity," Victoria interrupted gently, "and I didn't hire you just because you were skilled. I hired you because I wanted to prove something, to myself, maybe to my father's memory, that the system could work differently, that merit could triumph over prejudice if someone with power chose to make it so." She smiled faintly. "You've proven that more thoroughly than I could have hoped, not just by doing good work, but by maintaining your dignity and integrity, even when men like Garrett tried to break you." Caleb looked out at the ranch, at the life he'd built here, at the future that had seemed impossible just months ago. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Victoria replied. "Just keep being the man you are. Keep showing Lily that kindness and hard work matter. That's payment enough." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Mrs. Brennan," Caleb said finally. "Victoria," she corrected. "I think we're past formalities." "Victoria," he repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Thank you. Not just for the job, but for seeing me when others wouldn't, for giving me the chance to prove what I could do." "You earned every bit of it, Caleb," she said firmly. "Never forget that. Nobody gave you this. You fought for it and won it through your own merit." As Caleb walked back to his cabin, he saw Lily playing with some of the other ranch children near the horse corral, her laughter carrying on the evening breeze. She waved when she saw him, her face lit with genuine happiness. He waved back, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders that he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it was there. Sarah would be proud, he thought, not just of what he'd accomplished, but of how he'd done it, with integrity intact, with dignity preserved, with kindness still guiding his actions despite every reason to become bitter. That night, after tucking Lily into bed, Caleb stood at the cabin window, looking out at the vast expanse of the Brennan Ranch. This land, this opportunity, this future, it had all started with a simple act of kindness on a dusty trail. He'd helped a stranger fix a wagon wheel, expecting nothing in return. And in doing so, he'd fixed something far more important, his own broken life and the hope for his daughter's future. The wheel of fortune had turned, and for once it had turned in his favor, not through luck, not through charity, but through the simple, enduring power of doing the right thing, even when it cost you everything. Years later, when Lily was grown, and Caleb had become one of the most respected foremen in the territory, people would ask him about that day on the trail, about how he'd gone from homeless drifter to Victoria Brennan's right hand. He'd always smile and give the same answer, "I just fixed a wagon wheel." But both he and Victoria knew the truth, that what he'd really fixed was the broken belief that good people could still find good fortune in a hard world, and that was worth more than all the land in the territory. Remember to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories of kindness, resilience, and second chances. Turn on notifications so you never miss a tale that reminds us why integrity and compassion still matter in this world.